Hi, everyone. I'm Alan Robarge, an attachment-focused psychotherapist and a relationship educator. And I want to share this video with you. It's a live stream. It's the replay of a live stream that I created in the community program today, the community Improve Your Relationships. And I talk about attachment injuries, attachment wounds, and attachment trauma, and look at the criteria in assessing how we would determine if our attachment injuries do in fact point towards attachment trauma, living with symptoms of hyperarousal, intrusion, and constriction. And all of this points towards adaptive strategies, adaptive behaviors to try to get our attachment needs met, but also to manage that distress, that feeling in our nervous system, a dysregulated nervous system, the fear, the panic. Relationships can be so stressful when we're living with unresolved, unintegrated attachment trauma. Now, this particular video, like I shared, it is part of a live stream in the community. I want to let you know and be introduced to the type of conversations and discussions that we're having. And you are invited to join us. And in fact, we're in a new launch, a new cycle of the program. And if you want to join, now is a really great time to check it out. Also, over the years, I know there have been a number of YouTube subscribers and people who follow me who've been members, and I do have members who leave and exit and then they come back. And now would be a great time to come back if you're interested or want to hear more of live video similar to the one that I'm going to show you now. This video is only going to be on YouTube for a limited time. If you want to learn more about the community, check out the description so that you could learn more there. Thank you so much, and I hope that you enjoy the video, and I hope that it's helpful. So let's jump in. Week number 1. Thank you for joining. And this particular video is not like the welcome to week number 1 videos, the discussion topic video that every week there is a video as well as a video on the suggested activity, a bit about program structure, and also gets the wheels turning to think about partner relationships. This is in addition to that video, and I'm not really, that video has a kind of introduction quality to it. This, I just want to jump in and share some ideas and think about partner relationships and think about exploring what does it mean to invite intimacy and vulnerability into our life. And this invitation becomes a mirror. Everything we're doing, this is a mirror to look at ourselves and to look at our thoughts. And that's really specifically what this week number 1 is all about. Partner relationships is that we want to step back and think, well, how do my thoughts influence the way that I'm in relationships, and what are my core beliefs that influence how I'm in relationship, be it if I'm dating or if I'm in a partnership. Now, I'm going to jump forward in my notes, is that I thought I was going to share this at the end, but I think it's really helpful to share it at the beginning, is that I want to mention that not all of us in this moment, in the community, in our lives, want to be in a partner relationship. Not all of us are in a partner relationship. And also, there are some of us who feel that we have missed the opportunity. The window has passed, and we don't really see ourselves wanting to be in a relationship in the future, partner relationship. And then some of us are like hurt. We're just like really hurt, and it's we're taking an honest inventory, saying, I don't know if I could jeopardize being hurt again. So I want to acknowledge that there's a lot here for us to take away, if perhaps that is true of you, that you don't want to be in a partner relationship. I mean, some people will hear partner relationship and say, well, that's not that important to me, so I don't know, why I want to explore week number 1 discussion topic. And we're studying partner relationships because they really help illuminate degrees of intimacy. And they really help illuminate looking at our adaptive strategies around getting our unmet needs met. And this can show up anywhere then. It doesn't just have to be partner relationships. Partner relationships also really illuminate the degree of intimacy that we crave in life, and in general, our desire for emotional closeness. So we don't have to want to be in a partner relationship to learn from partner relationships. And I think what's really important is that there's many avenues, many ways to create relationship that is meaningful. And I get a lot of pushback on this point because a number of us are so fixated on wanting a particular type of partner relationship, and they say, well, it's just not the same. It's not the same. Don't get the same kind of charge and intimacy and intensity and vulnerability that you would in a partner relationship. And I'm not going to argue that. I mean, okay, maybe that's true. And before I die, if I choose not to be in a partner relationship, I still can choose to be creative and resourceful about how I create intimacy, because I still want it in my life. And so there is an invitation here to say, if there are obstacles or uh, uh, choices where you're making not to pursue a romantic partner relationship, we still need to then challenge ourselves and say, well, how can we be creative and resourceful and invite a depth of intimacy in my life that is nourishing, and invite some vulnerability, because as a human being, I crave that closeness. And that's the part that I think, as a big picture culture, many cultures were lacking a realization that we can think outside of the box, and it doesn't have to be just in the form of a partner relationship. Also, for many of us, at this juncture, it might immediately illuminate our defeatist attitude that, well, if I can't have the romantic narrative of soulmates becoming one and living this vision and dream that I've always wanted and I see in movies, and it seems other people have it and I don't. And so then my life is over and I'm a loser. And there's this real intense shutting down. And so this week is also about, where are you shut down? Where have you been shut down? For me to reflect on my own shutdownness, and we look at our guardedness. So much about adaptive responses are trying to manage to protect and preserve and not reveal how guarded that we actually are in our relationships. So that's the invitation to talk about guardedness and defendedness, and to realize we have a lot of good reasons that we might be that way. And in order to continue to grow in relationships, we have to challenge ourselves to soften and risk again, open your heart again. And hopefully we do it in a way that is prudent and discerning and with boundaries and some wisdom, which is why we have the community. Hopefully that's a way that you can utilize the community. So I want to introduce a range in 3 words: attachment injuries, attachment wounds, and attachment trauma. Because a lot of what we're doing, not only this week, but the whole premise of the community every week, is utilizing, looking at relationship through the lens of attachment injuries, attachment wounds, and attachment trauma. I present those in this way, to begin to think in terms of a range and a continuum, and that there's a subjective evolution of your own development, of where you might fall within that spectrum and what might that mean. And please begin to create your own definition in your own words, to uncover, what does it exactly mean: attachment injuries, attachment wounds, attachment trauma. Now, for me, attachment injuries are really honing in on criteria for assessment, or criteria of very, very individualistic components of like things that happened or things that didn't happen, and the individual experiences that turn out like, well, that behavior resulted in an attachment injury, and I could see how it's a criteria that would go into me discerning and looking at attachment wounds and attachment trauma. Now, when I define attachment wounds, and again, you are invited to define it for yourself, I think of it as the collective. It's all of the attachment injuries together. It's like this umbrella term that's holding it all together, and say, because of all these different components and criteria of things that happen resulting in attachment injuries, when I pull them all together, the summation of them is that this is my attachment wound. And for some of us, this attachment wound has a presence or a prevalence, is that a word? A prevalence in our adult relationships. When we're interacting, it might still very much show up. Other times it can be dormant, and even though we've had attachment wounds, it doesn't necessarily mean that we have attachment trauma. Now, when I use the word attachment trauma, I'm now thinking of these attachment wounds, this wound with all of the injuries are unprocessed, unintegrated, lodged themselves in my body through dysregulation in my nervous system, and there was an experience of overwhelm, conscious or unconscious, when it comes to vulnerability and intimacy. And to start linking the word trauma to attachment then is we're starting to think in just somewhat universal terms of trauma as symptoms being triggered and showing up as the three main general characters of hyperarousal, intrusion, and constriction. And similar to like PTSD, we enter a relationship and we might not even know that we have attachment trauma that is dormant living. And then it's the intimacy, the vulnerability, the depth of that intimacy is actually the trigger. That's what activates it, is that we drop down into the incredible vulnerable place that we were historically, for most of us, many of us in a family context, our family attachment figures, our parents, primary caregivers. And just to acknowledge, as I try to say as often as I can, that it doesn't have to be from childhood, but a number of us are working from that history. Let's identify, I want to name some of the criteria that we're thinking about as we're trying to assess, what are our attachment injuries, and where do they come from? And then we could see how, well, this might actually be informing the type of partners that I pick in adult relationships. It might be informing how I behave in adult relationships. And excuse me real quick. So we take an inventory of being emotionally ignored. We can take an inventory of maybe some of us were emotionally dismissed and shut down. And these are how we start to think about this is the origin of attachment injuries. When your emotional experience was unacknowledged and diminished and just not even valued. And maybe that was not unique to you and your parent. It could be the culture in the family. The family system is, we don't acknowledge each other emotionally, and we pretend we don't have an emotional life, and we don't give a lot of weight and value to communicating through emotion. And in fact, we're going to diminish it. So this can really greatly impact how we bond, the quality of bonding. It can really greatly impact the type of attachment that we create with a parent. You know, I love you, parent, and parent says, I love you back, and we're connected, we're trying to connect. And oh, by the way, either overtly, covertly, directly, indirectly, the parent does not care, does not show caring, does not show interest in your emotional world. And so we immediately have this internal dilemma. I want to be connected to the parent. I want this attachment bond, but I'm also simultaneously being rejected for who I am in the realm of emotional self, expressing emotions. And now we immediately have a double bind. In order to stay connected or nourish the attachment bond, I am going to also accept being emotionally ignored. And those two things are at odds. One's attempting to build connection, the other one is distancing us from connection. Another criteria as assessment to think about is missing the window of responsiveness and also a lack of emotional responsiveness. What this means is that we could have a parent who has some, or a partner, doesn't have to be a parent, but we could have a partner who has some awareness that emotional responsiveness is needed. However, they perhaps are afraid and very much are avoidant and will not take the lead very easily to acknowledge emotional disconnect or acknowledge that an emotional response is needed. And they will miss the window of responsiveness. And at some point, uh, it's not necessarily a cognitive choice, but at some point, it's like if you're not going to respond with some sense of immediacy of when there's a need for repair or when there's a disconnect, and if there's not a somewhat immediate response, and we all have a range of this window of responsiveness that makes it a bit subjective. But imagine, you know, if a partner or a parent says something, you know, remember 2 months ago when you were hurt and you wanted to share your sadness, and I rolled my eyes and I was dismissive, and well, I realized, you know, now 2 months have passed, I realized that, you know, I'm open to hear what you have to say. At that point, you would feel like, well, it's a little too late. You know, you really missed the boat on that one. So that also, imagine living your life. Many of us know this experience firsthand, where you attempt to share something about yourself, to reveal some vulnerability, be it an emotional insight, and there's a time sensitive window that you want the other person to respond back, and that they don't. And if this happens developmentally on a regular basis, we can notice that it's going to start showing up as attachment injuries. Now, we might also, as a criteria, start assessing for lack of curiosity about each other's inner world. We could also notice a lack of depth in inviting deeper levels of understanding. It is okay to be more surface and not really be interested in having a relationship of depth or conversations of depth or exploring from a depth place. That's perfectly legitimate when we choose to do that, and perfectly legitimate when we pick a partner where we negotiate and say, hey, I'm really not into depth conversations, and it really doesn't interest me that much, and I'd sort of like to keep things light and just enjoy each other, and let's have dinner and you know, have fun together. And there are a number of people who say, great, you know, yes, that's what I want. If you happen to be someone who wants a little more going into the layers and inviting depth, and you notice a chronic not happening, this is not happening, and if your history is you're the type of person who've wanted this, perhaps maybe even all your life, and in your family, again, if we're honing in on family of origin history regarding attachment injuries, this could very much show up as a missed opportunity, a way that your attachment needs were not met. We're also going to think about obstacles to proximity, physicality, touch, and closeness. proximity, how approximate, where is the person in the house, in the room, in my life? Do I have a regular access to this person? Because that's going to affirm and strengthen trust and safety. And even when we literally lock eyes and look at each other, there's the nonverbal communication. Are you here? Yeah, I'm here. Are you here? Yeah. Is it safe to be me? Yeah, it's so safe. It's safe to, yes, I see you. And it's that proximity, and then the physicality. Many of us had parents who worked a lot, who just physically weren't there. Parents who travel on their job and they're not there. These periods of absence are also something to really think about regarding criteria for assessment of attachment injuries. There's also mentioned touch and closeness. Did we have a reasonable, generous amount of touch in a way that was appropriate and invited and felt good, and a pat on the back, and holding your hand, and just that general sense of closeness. Something else to think about: criticalness or judgment or even punishment when feelings were expressed. So we've already mentioned being emotionally ignored, being emotionally dismissed, or lack of emotional responsiveness. And let's say you attempted, your nature is that you do want to share more of who you are emotionally. And if you grew up in an environment where there was some criticalness or judgment or maybe even punishment for sharing your feelings, this very much can create attachment injuries, and then confusion around sharing emotionally with partners and with friends, etc. We're also going to think about the inconsistency of engagement, meaning confusion about when is it our time, that we need a rhythm, we need a reliable sense of, I know that they're there and I'm going to be able to find them there when I need them. And I know we're going to have our time and they're going to make time for me. So again, if we're looking at some history where that was compromised, then we might be thinking about how does this show up as a history of attachment injuries. We're also looking at lack of relationship repair when there is an attachment disconnect. And in attachment lingo, they often use the word rupture, which I think is somewhat a bit too violent at times. I also, a range from disconnect to rupture. But that when there is something that needs addressed, that someone stepped on someone's toes, or someone was a bit insensitive, unable to provide an emotional response that really communicates, I care about you, I'm still here for you, I'm still connected with you, I love connecting with you through our emotional exchange. And if that was missed, then we need to repair that it was missed. Now, I think some of us have a history, and specifically in family situations, and it could be in our adult partner relationships, where there's very little repair, if any, that repair is not even acknowledged. So we are trained to tolerate the disappointment that comes with emotional absence. And we develop this really great sophisticated tolerance for not even for going without relationship repair, that the other person would initiate and say, I want to acknowledge that I bet you feel shut out, and you shared, you created an invitation for me to share in your joy and your excitement over what happened, and I really wasn't available. and I'd like to acknowledge that I want to be available because you're important to me. So if we didn't have that kind of repair, it also compounds and is something to think about when we're assessing for attachment injuries. Prolonged periods of separation, either physically or emotionally. I think I mentioned that earlier. Also, love and affection were withheld both intentionally and unintentionally, both overtly and covertly. And initially I wrote love and affection, but for me what's more important is the word attention. Love, affection, and intention. And it should be a little personal, or the how this arrived or came to the forefront for me is that I did have, in my history and in my home and in my childhood, I very much had a baseline of love and affection. And so that then becomes very, very confusing if we just say love and affection were withheld. And I say, I don't know, I don't think that that's true for me. But I always I add the word attention, because then it makes sense. There was a limitation to the amount of attention that my parents and family were able to offer in order to see me, in order to hear me, in order to be curious about my inner world. And for the longest time, it was so confusing to assess for attachment injuries, attachment wounds, and attachment trauma, because we can have attachment injuries. And for me personally, I can have an attachment wound and I can have attachment trauma that I'm living with in my life and still say I had connections of love and there was shared affection. And oh, by the way, there were limitations around the degrees of attention that would strengthen attachment bonds and not undermine them. So we're looking at, as adults now, we did that kind of inventory, that assessment, these categories. And now as adults, looking at degrees of activation of when this attachment distress shows up, and then how do we manage it? And the reason why we focus with partner relationships also very early on here in the community is just because partner relationships create high activation. There's a degree of intensity, and for many of us, until we're in a partner relationship, we wouldn't even really think that we have attachment trauma. But it's once the hormonal cocktail, the ingredients, everything that goes into the level of dependency and risk and trust and safety, and then all of our history gets churned up and stirred up, and then we have high activation. And so what we want to look at, and the reason why we're picking partner relationships, is that when this attachment distress shows up, how do you manage it? And for many of us, the way that we manage it are these default settings that we learned in childhood that we might not even fully be conscious of, and they're adaptive behaviors and strategies to try to get our needs met, but still operating from the perspective that our needs are not going to get met. This usually creates two polarities and two poles. There's a simplicity in what I want to say, but I think it's a good launching off point. And that's either we become really, really needy and we try harder to get our attachment needs met, or we realize that this is not a safe place and we need to retreat and separate and pull back and distance. And you might be familiar with these two poles. They're the foundation of what we would think about insecure attachment, of preoccupied anxious behavior, and then avoidantly attached. And it's the tension between the two of when one tries to move towards the other and that person then distances more, and we call that the negative cycle, and just feeds off of each other. And everybody has pretty much the same need of wanting to try to get attachment needs met, but we just don't know how to do it outside of this negative dance that we've created. One adaptive response then that we have to all of this attachment distress is reality distortion, which quite honestly is one of my favorite because I just like the way it sounds. And it's really pointing us towards our thoughts and our thinking and our values, and how do our thoughts contribute to distorting reality, and how is distorting reality an extension of not getting our attachment needs met? And that's where we introduce the romantic narrative, which is a kind of cultural launching off point, and that there are many different romantic narratives for different cultures, and there's some crossover and like comparative mythology. We could say, well, there's kind of a collective one, but let's just acknowledge what we're saying might or might not apply to all cultures or the culture that you live in. Then there's also romantic narratives that show up in subcultures. So there might be the main culture's romantic narrative, and then let's say there's a subculture that says, hey, I don't want to be a part of that. I'm not interested in that. So they've adopted and created a kind of counter different romantic narrative that's still based upon some reality distortion and trying to get attachment needs met through fantasy projection, our assumptions, and um, not really being able to show up and reveal who we are, and ultimately wanting the other person not to really show up who they are, because what's more important is living in the story than living in reality. And if we defend the story, then we can defend our fantasy relationship. And why do we love fantasy relationship and create fantasy relationships so much? Well, because we had to overcompensate in our history. Again, if we're referencing childhood, and say, you know, we didn't quite fully have the consciousness to say, hey, wait a minute, my family's emotionally absent. Instead, we were a little generous, and our brain creates, it fills in the gaps, and our brain is able to overlook or activate some denial of saying, it doesn't really hurt when I'm ignored in my family. We're close. I have a good family. They love me and I love them. And we're not even going to acknowledge that I'm emotionally ignored. And so if I have that really great skill of just ignoring when I'm emotionally ignored, I'm a great candidate for creating fantasy relationships and picking partners who want to collude in a fantasy relationship. So this invites core beliefs. We really want to look at how are our core beliefs influencing fantasy relating. We can decode the romantic narrative to begin to uncover this. Let's say you have a core belief that life is more meaningful with a partner. And so what happens if you don't have a partner? Your core belief is then creating this reality that your life is less than. Life is less than, that I don't have a soulmate. You know, life is just lacking that something extra. And sure, I like my life, but if I had a partner, then, you know, then everything would be shiny and sparkly. That can really that impacts our outlook about how we feel about ourselves and how we feel about others. We're going to look at our core beliefs of how they link to a deep desire for connection. If that we really, really, really want a deep connection, please. It is so important. And if I have this belief of this deep desire for connection, and I really believe in that, I might be willing to compromise and pick people who might not be the best choice for me, because it's more important to try to fulfill the need of this deep desire than actually realize that the person that I'm with is not the right choice for me. So it does set us up to ignore red flags and warning signs. And again, what I said earlier, which we can fill in the gaps, we might not fully feel trusting of the person. We might not really feel completely safe, but we have a history of being able to override that and just sort of substitute it with a kind of blanket denial. We also might have core beliefs that link to our negative self-talk and a negative self-image that just over time, if we have a history of attachment injuries and attachment wounds, and now gets activated as attachment trauma, And relationships are hard, and we struggle, and then we conclude, say, well, I'm just not lovable. I I just don't I don't deserve love, and I'm going to be alone for the rest of my life. That I'm flawed and broken. So, even that, going in that direction of drawing conclusions about your identity and self, that is as much a fantasy too. That's not true either, because it's all still based on the history of the attachment injuries. Now, if you might have experienced, as I'm already talking, as we start to begin to assess and look at attachment injuries, and start thinking about, hey, what are our core beliefs, especially when it comes to partner relationships in the romantic narrative, is that we inevitably uncover and bump into our good friend grief, and that it can really open up, and the pockets of grief, like, oh wow, I really missed out. And then that shows up in our relationships too. We thought that we're going to have fun, connection, love, camaraderie, all the joyful, positive things that we would use, that we want to define relationship. And some of us get into relationship, and it just uncovers so much grief. In that, again, the intimacy and the vulnerability are the trigger of the trauma. And so we're practicing a depth of intimacy, and it's also simultaneously opening up the depth of grief that is still living there. And we find ourselves, well, I didn't really, why am I crying so much? My relationship's going great. I met this great, and I have so much grief that's surfacing. Potentially it's because we have attachment injuries that need attention. So as I've already said, what we're trying to do is create a launching off point using some cultural reference of the romantic narrative. Now, these narratives, specifically when I just say romantic narrative, emphasizes dependency and an engulfment of merging as one. We are one, we are soulmates, we finish each other's sentences. I just feel like we've known each other our whole lives, and we want to spend so much time together, and the vision, the shared story is like complete immersing. Let's just forget our previous life. We now have this other shared experience of great intensity, of completely melting into each other and becoming one. And there's an emphasis in these narratives on dependency. So the problem here, I've written down 3 problems. The first one is that we would want our partner to be an extension of our identity, meaning we can lose ourselves. I look good next to you, you look good next to me, you really enhance me, I hope I enhance you, and we are now we're a we, and this we is more important than the me. And the we life that we have now is more important than the life I had before we were this joined as one we. And my identity is now wrapped up in this, and I've created this hierarchy of importance where our engulfment, our melting into each other, is so important. I've lost sight of me. I don't even know who I am. I don't even want to be. I just want us to. I can't even be that anymore. I've lost my sense of self. You can imagine how problematic this is. And I know for me personally, this has happened to me. I know many of us here, you've experienced this. So empathy to us. The next one, the narrative emphasizes dependency, engulfment, and merging. So a problem with that is that we want our partner to manage our attachment distress. So if we're one, if I have dependency and I'm feeling distress, oh good, it's your responsibility to help me calm down or help me manage my emotions. Now, we have to be careful here because this is not black and white. From secure relating, secure attachment, that's very much a beautiful, secure quality that can work in tandem or as a balanced dance back and forth, that we do help each other regulate emotionally. We do help each other calm down when one of us are upset, and that we do use our relationship to feel a sense of safety, and it buffers us from the big bad world, and that we can find refuge and sanctuary and rely on, really receive and rely on. All of those things are very beautiful and necessary. That's not really what I'm talking about in this context. It's more of, I'm not going to do that for myself. I'm not really going to bring that skill to do it for us together. I'm more going to be a bit passive and be quick to think it's your responsibility to help me manage when I'm upset. And if I'm not getting my attachment needs met, and I might have to engage in some protest behavior and let you know that I'm not getting my needs met, I still expect you to fix it for me. And that's as you know, that's not going to work in a partnership. The other problem here that we want to acknowledge regarding this, when narratives emphasize dependency, is that we want our partner to save us and protect us. And again, at face value, that sounds pretty reasonable. I mean, of course, I want to be with all people who are in general on board with protecting me and helping me survive, and I want to protect them and help them survive. But that's not so much what we mean here. We more mean in an imbalanced kind of way. Now, what I'm pointing out here, and excuse me real quick, what I'm pointing out here are adult versus child needs, or mature immature relating. And many of us, I know we don't like the word immature. If I say, well, I'm immature in my relationships, I default to younger framework, even age regression. I'm coming from a place of skills that I learned when I was age 8 and age 10, because I haven't really quite learned other skills as an adult. And if I'm defaulting to what I know and referencing what I know, I'm pretty much immature in my relationships. And I know that many of us don't like to hear that. So feel free to change the word, find a word that works for you. For me personally, I find it a bit freeing to say, oh, wow, that's what's happening. I'm immature. Okay, I get it. And to me, it also sets up on the horizon, like, oh, maturity's on the horizon. Like, that's the direction that I'm going. So these three things that I talked about, this emphasis on dependency, I said the problem when we want our partner to be an extension of our identity, when we want our partner to manage our attachment distress, or when we want our partner to save us and protect us. Now I'm just going to change the word partner to mother and say we want our mother to be an extension of our identity. Well, yes, of course, that's how we, dip our foot into the pool of life and figure out who we are. We borrow her identity and she helps craft our identity. And that's how we grow and evolve. We want our mother to manage our attachment distress. Well, yes, of course, totally reasonable. That's what a mother does. Helps, soothe and calm down and say, "Oh, honey, I'm here. It's okay. You don't need to be as scared as you are. It's scary, but we're going to get through this." And the mother's like a coach, coaching you to manage emotions and showing you how to regulate through when she regulates. We want our mother to save us and protect us. Yes, I think that's like literally in the job description of the mother manual. So do you see, I just took the three problems that we create when we frame relationships from a narrative of dependency, and they're really rooted in some core needs and child to parent relating. And so then that brings me to my next point of like adult to adult relating versus child to adult relating. And it's not black or white. I mean, let's give ourselves credit. For most of us, it's not black or white. We could say, well, in this scenario, I'm doing adult to adult relating. I've had a couple relationships where very early on, I was very conscious. I tried to be conscious of a lot of this. And I feel proud and can say, you know what? I did show up in adult to adult relating, and I worked to maintain that. Now, certain life circumstances happened, and churned and stirred up the hormonal cocktail and the craziness and the seeing things through the lens of attachment injuries and needs going unmet. And then at some point, I could notice how, I think I'm coming from an immature place, and I'm really relating as a kind of like child to parent dynamic. But for most of us, it's not just black or white, that we just do that once, that we pick one or the other. It's usually we practice as best we can. So what we're doing this week, we're monitoring our thoughts, we're monitoring how we work with our mind, we're monitoring our core beliefs around attachment distress. And an important thing to think about, why are we doing all this monitoring in our mind and our thoughts? And it's because relationship mostly happens in your head. Relationship, resoundingly, percentage-wise, is a series of thoughts and feelings and stories that you're telling yourself, about the other person, and about the relationship. If we really technically, literally track the shared experience and the attempt to have a shared reality, it is so much less than actually the relationship in our head or in my head. So when I'm in a relationship, I'm thinking about it way much more than in reality, that there's actually real data and real experience and real evidence and real shared time occurring. It's an incredible, grand story that's taking place in my head. So it would be really nice if I had some skill to really reflect on, well, how do I think, and what are my core beliefs, and how do I work with my mind? The other thing related to this is that we create our own attachment distress. Like, the other person didn't even do anything. In reality, and this sort of links still to like reality distortion or distorting reality, but we can induce our own attachment distress based upon a story that we're telling ourselves that really has nothing to do with the other person. And wouldn't this be a good skill to confront and realize that we do? And so many relationship conflicts happen because of this thing that I'm describing. Imagine we imagine and assume that what the other person is thinking, and we're expecting that they're mind readers, or that I'm a mind reader. And this very much strengthens the romantic narrative, assumes that we just know each other. We know each other so well, we don't even have to ask. Um, but if I imagine or assume something and assign thoughts to another person, but then I get all bent out of shape because what I'm imagining they're thinking, and now I have attachment distress based upon what I'm manufacturing. I mean, this gets this is really complicated, sophisticated neurosis, sophisticated suffering. The other person doesn't have to do anything. And I could create this, I can create attachment distress all on my own, but I'm imagining that they're responsible, projecting stories, assumptions, and expectations on our partner, and in the relationship, uh, what we've already said, to the point that it becomes a fantasy. And then also, when we uncover or trigger old hurts, like the old places that still needed, that are really hurting, and something gets exposed, like the band-aid gets ripped off or the old scar opens up, we are unable to see it as the old scar, but we relate it to the current relationship with the partner, and we think they're responsible, and now we assign the pain we're feeling to they're creating it. and we are going to argue and negotiate and really demand that they meet our attachment needs, because if they did, this pain would go away, and they're not even responsible for the pain or even have nothing to do with it. This is, again, our old attachment wounds waking up. And when we're in partner relationships, oftentimes many of us don't realize that's what we're signing up for. A lot of my history, that's what happened to me a number of times. It's like, where is all this pain and grief coming from? And it took me years and years and years to say, I don't think it's about the other person. I really don't. You know, I just think it's funny how obvious that is, and it takes me years and years to figure it out. 3 questions for ending today, sharing some ideas and thoughts here in this particular video. 3 questions are: when are you in adult to adult relating, and when are you in child to adult relating? And so it begs the question, even to answer that, how the heck would I know that? And in this moment, I'm not going to go off on a tangent and explore those ideas. But I think in order to answer that, you then have to start thinking about, what is the criteria, or how would I discern in my body? What evidence do I use? What is the felt sense of adult to adult relating versus child to adult relating? And this is pointing towards what I was just talking about, this dependency, framing partner relationship through a lens or through a narrative of dependency. The next is, how defended and guarded are you when it comes to intimacy and vulnerability? And I really think this is almost the $1,000,000 question, that we need to really be honest with ourselves and learn how to gently invite in a potential partner and gently revisit the conversation that we, for the most part, many of us, logically, it just makes sense that you're going to be defended and guarded. So it's not that, look at how incredibly totally open and carefree I am. It's more of, look at how I'm aware of when and how I'm guarded and defended. And I have some sophisticated, mature skill to let down the wall and to maneuver within that place so that I don't cut myself off from relationships. But this defended guardedness also protects me. It's also prudent as a way to, life is scary and relationships are not always safe. So maintaining a defended guardedness, not from a wounded extreme place, but from a workability place. So the question, how defended and guarded are you when it comes to intimacy and vulnerability? And then the last question that I wrote down here, what is one core belief about relationship that gets in your way? And that could be a core belief about yourself, a core belief about how partners behave, a core belief about love, a core belief about what a relationship is supposed to give you or do for you. So what is one core belief about relationships that gets in the way? Thank you so much for listening. As I said previously, this video will show up as a replay, so you can come back and look at it. Thank you for listening, and I hope this sparks some conversation and self-reflection. And as part of being in the community, as a community member, create a new post, share an idea, an insight, something that perhaps inspired you or that you thought about. You can add it to the comment section when I post this as a replay, or you could also just create a new post about, hey, you know what I'm thinking about, and then have at it and share an idea. We grow as a community when we share our insights, and we strengthen a sense of belonging when we realize, hey, oh my, I'm not the only one living with this. I'm not the only one thinking about this. So this is it. Week number 1, we're off. Let's talk about partner relationships. Thank you so much.